If you're enjoying the podcast and would like to help me keep it going, here's a few things you could do to help. You can make a donation on my website, andyhedges.com. While you're there, you can join my email list. Or you could give me a 5-star rating and write a review on the iTunes store. And most important of all, you could take the time to tell a friend to listen to the show. I'd like to kick off today's show with another poem from Andy Wilkinson's Charlie Goodnight album. This one is titled, Driving at Night on the Plains. Driving at night on the plains is a dream in glitter and black Vaseline, a dream of black velvet Elvises hung like tapestries underneath bare bulbs strung from the top of a drive-in movie screen. Driving at night on the plains is a dream of the moon in a snow-cone cup, of a constellation holding it up, made up of mercury vapor-light stars, headlamps of faraway slow-motion cars, and reflections of washed-out searchlight beams. Driving at night on the plains is a dream of shadows so deep and so dense that horizons evaporate into hints and innuendos of worlds without ends, where windshields stop, infinity begins, that side of glass and cold metal seems. Driving at night on the plains is a dream of radio tower red slow-blinking lights, of strobes obnoxious and blue-tinted white, of space station look-alike oil drilling rigs pumping blackness from silent subterranean digs where the dark is so deep that the elements scream. Driving at night on the plains is a dream. Howdy folks, this is Andy Hedges, and you're listening to Cowboy Crossroads. On each episode, I interview a different guest and ask them to share stories and discuss music, poetry, and culture from the working cowboy west and beyond. My guest today is Andy Wilkinson. If you haven't already listened to the first part of my interview with Andy, I would recommend going back to the last episode and listening to that first part of our conversation. On this second part of the interview, I asked Andy to talk about his personal relation to Charlie Goodnight. Here's Andy Wilkinson.
Well, we did hear about it. He's kin to me. He's my great-grandmother's grandmother's brother. So he's my great uncle. He and Marianne had no children. There's some murky references that she had miscarriages. Corinne, the summer after they married in February, incidentally, he proposed to Corinne on February 14th. I don't know if Valentine was the deal in 1926 or not, but he proposed to her on February 14th. She became pregnant that summer and had a miscarriage. So Goodnight never had his own children. But he, as I had mentioned earlier, he was very fond of Elizabeth, his older sister. I think he may have been closer to her than any of his other siblings. And he was close to his stepbrother Wes. Wes moved out to Colorado, and that was one of the reasons Goodnight took those cattle out. But my great-grandmother went to college at Goodnight College. She was a painter. In fact, she lived in Goodnight because Charlie sent word back once he'd established the little town of Goodnight in the college and had moved off the JA. He sent word back to his family in the Palo Pinto area, the Cross Timbers, this is a place to come. So they moved out there. Elizabeth, his sister, didn't, but her daughter, my great-grandmother's mother, moved out and brought the family with them. And so my great-grandmother grew up there and then went to Goodnight College and studied painting. And as soon as she graduated, taught painting at Goodnight College. And she married a fellow named Andy Young Ingham, And they wound up first in Oklahoma, but then settled in Texoma, Texas. Not Lake Texoma, but Texoma, up in the Panhandle near Goodwill and right where the two panhandles come together. And that's where she lived out her life and where my grandmother was raised. And Andy Young Ingham, my great-grandmother's husband, my great-grandfather, was a hardworking guy and a carpenter and a handyman. And so when they would come stay summers at the Goodnight Ranch in Goodnight, he was always, and I didn't know him quite all that well because I was very small and he was very old. But I never saw him other than at night listening to the radio and smoking his pipe. He was always doing something. And so that's something that Goodnight really liked. So I think Goodnight loved to have them come down. My grandmother was a little bit scared of him because he was pretty gruff, and she tried to take a picture of him one time, and he threatened to smash that camera if she took another picture of him. She was there at my grandmother was there at the last buffalo hunt, well-documented story. And so I grew up hearing these stories, and we'd go up to Texoma to visit my great-grandmother, and they'd talk about Uncle Charlie and, with reverence, and Aunt Mary Goodnight, whom they really, Charlie was a tough kind of cadre sort of fellow, but they just loved Mary Ann, their Aunt Mary. And so they talked about that, and, as a little kid, not many of us pay a lot of attention to what old folks say about their relations. But I distinctly remember, and it must have been the third grade, maybe the fourth, but whatever in those years in the 50s that Texas history was taught, I get my Texas history book in grade school that fall, that September, and lo and behold, there's not only a picture of Charlie Goodnight, but it's the same picture, a framed copy of which is hanging in my grandmother's house. And so I remember distinctly thinking, golly, there really is something to this, about Charlie Goodnight being a famous person. So that started, then I became friends in junior high school with two really important people in my life, Byron Price and Jim Pfluger. And they were both, even at that age, were top-notch historians, and they remain top-notch historians today. And when they, in particular Byron, found out that I was kin of Charlie Goodnight, it was like, boy, he wasn't going to let me slip in my attention to that. So it's always been a part of my growing up and listening to those, a few stories that they have. Of course, my grandmother was the oldest, her family. Her mother was the oldest of her family, and her mother was the oldest of their family. So all the way back to Elizabeth, these were women, and they were the oldest child of that family. So while there were all that 5 generations difference, they were very compressed in time, since these were oldest children. But still, my grandmother in particular was pretty small. She was 13 at the last buffalo hunt. And then she had moved off and married by the time Goodnight remarried and then died. And so she has girlhood memories, but a lot of them. So I would hear that, and that, that's the thing that kind of keeps it in front of you. So that's how I'm kin. When I hear somebody say people try to say I'm a grandson, and I say, no, he didn't have any children. Or I'll hear someone say they were a grandchild of Goodnight, and I know that's not the case. In fact, if their name's Goodnight, the odds of them being kin to Charlie are pretty remote. Elijah's kids, I think, there was one at least that bore the Goodnight name, and they're descendants of Elijah's in Dallas area. But most of them were girls, and so they took on other names. And so it's kind of interesting to be connected in that way.
In the introduction to his 1994 book and album, Charlie Goodnight, His Life in Poetry and Song, Andy Wilkinson wrote this: I do not wish to tell Charlie Goodnight's history, although I've been faithful to the facts. Rather, it is my hope to tell the truth that lies beyond these facts. To do so, I've been selective in which incidents and instances I've used for my poems and songs picking those that have much to say about Charlie Goodnight, but everything to say about us. For you and I are the sons and daughters of Charlie Goodnight.
I mentioned that I have this great friendship with Byron Price and Jim Pfluger. Jim at the time may have still been at the Panhandle Plains, but I think he'd already been hired to start the Quarter Horse Museum. And Byron at that time was running the Cowboy Hall of Fame. And Byron and I talked an awful lot about Goodnight, and I was already writing things from stories that I would come across. I wrote a song called Handmade Gift about a story that I found or was shown to me by someone who worked here at the Southwest Collection, a narration by a woman to whom that had happened. And so I was interested in that, and I got interested in that crossing the Pecos the first time, and what a dramatic scene that had to have been. And so the first song I wrote in that whole thing was Crossing the Pecos. So I played it for Byron, and I said, here's what we ought to do. Let's see if we can find a film crew that would like to follow you and I, and let's ride the Goodnight loving trail. And you're the historian, and I'm the balladeer, I'll come along, not like Monty Python, but I'll come along and I'll write a series of songs for every place that we visit. And Byron said, "Man, that's a great idea. Let's do it." Well, he was busier than hunting dog, and there's that whole idea of getting money, and shooting on location is really expensive. It was really expensive back then. It would have been filmed that nobody had this would have been in the 80s, late 80s. Nobody would have had the quality of digital video to have done that kind of thing. And so Byron said, "Well, why don't you just go ahead and write the songs?" So I said, "Okay, well, I'll do that. Now I'll write some poems." And so I got started on the project, and I would send things to Byron. I pretty much had the album finished, and Byron said, "You're going to have to tell that story of Cynthia Ann Parker." And man, that was I had not thought about doing that. Here's a woman's story. There are no heroes in that story. How do you do that? And that was a great challenge for me to write that. I had gone down to Dallas doing something, and I knew the story about the little boy, Goodnight, 9-year-old boy, seeing the very first time he saw a buffalo was at that crossing of the Trinity in present-day Dallas. And so I went down there to this hill where, the conspiracy theorists think the other shooter was in the Kennedy assassination. And so there I was walking around with all these conspiracy theorists, who were all taking measurements and looking at things, trying to, I guess, get things to prove their own book. And I got to looking at it and saw, wait, where is the Trinity? And there's this big concrete gash in the land, to the west of where we were in Dealey Plaza. And I realized, wait a minute, that's what the Trinity used to be, a river that alligators used to come up all the way from the Gulf. There was a real river, and now it was this concrete ditch. And so that inspired that song. So I began to put the thing together and wrote these poems. And I had this idea all along that I didn't want it to be one voice, that it would be, when I was singing, it would be in Goodnight's voice. But I'd have other people sing other songs and do other poems. So I enlisted pals, Buck Ramsey, J.B. Allen, Byron Price did poems. I didn't know Barry Corbin yet, so he didn't appear on it. But the Maines family, there were just Rod Taylor, R.W. Hampton. There were this whole great group of people that I managed to get into the studio and to do it. And so we got ready to publish it. Well, no record company was going to have anything to do with it because it was a long project. And I decided, well, I'm going to do a book to go with it. And Deard Campbell did these drawings, and we put this all together. And every single person said, including my producer Lloyd, said, "You're never going to sell this," because we were going to have to sell it for like $30 in a box set. And it was a CD and a cassette in this book. in a box set, and we had the boxes specially made for it. And literally, I can't tell you how many people said, "Don't do this. You'll never get this thing paid for." Blah blah blah. And not only did that not be the case, we sold out of that stuff almost instantly. The first time we had a signing and a sales, we were at a bookstore and coffee shop on 82nd Street. The line went out of the coffee shop all down along the sidewalk of that shopping center. I mean, it was phenomenal. It's just one of those things that happened at the right time. Michael Martin Murphy, I'd given him a copy of it at Elko, and Murph invited us to come up and premiere it in Palo Duro September the 9th of that year, 1994, I think it was, and said he would stand good for the loss if we didn't get enough people, through the gate. Luckily, we had enough people come through. Most of them came up from Lubbock because we'd already had that great success in selling the project, the copies. And we got enough people in the theater that no one lost any money. But it was a really magical evening to do that there in the Palo Duro. We had this moon and a star, and about halfway through the performance, we first of all, we weren't smart, but we were very lucky. We built a campfire. Rod Taylor and J.B. Allen would get up and tend that fire during the performance. We sat in a semicircle around that fire and just did the songs. And it turned out to be brilliant, not smart, but brilliant, because it had this very natural feel to it. And about halfway through, all of us, like at one time, began to realize that anytime the lyric of the song or the line of the poem mentioned the word wind, the wind would pick up and blow. You'd see that smoke from that campfire swirling around. And it got to be really spooky. And, every one of us, as soon as the show was over, we were like, was that really happening? Everybody was talking about that. So it was this great evening that was just terrific. And so from that, it helped me a lot getting, not cemented, but getting recognized in the world of the cowpunch culture revival. But also Barry Corbin, whom I'd met once, but we weren't pals or anything, he got a copy of it and called me up and said, would it offend you if I did a one-man show about Goodnight? And I said, of course not. He's a public figure. I don't own him. I'm only one of a whole bunch of nieces and nephews that are kin to him. But being foolish and not knowing a thing about theater, I thought, well, a one-person show, that's kind of like a big, long song. I could do that. And I didn't realize yet, because I'd never been in theater. I'd never written for theater. I'd just been sitting in the audience. I loved, watching a play. It's one of my favorite things, but it never occurred to me to be a playwright. I didn't realize that in a one-person show, there's no dialogue, there's no action, and it's pretty hard to have a plot, So how do you do something that keeps somebody entertained for an hour and 45 minutes? But luckily, I was too stupid to know it was that difficult, or I would have never done it. So I get a chance to not only write a play, it's a play that gets produced, and it's a play that stars a well-known actor. And not only that, he's a well-known actor that's a damn good writer himself. And it was like a crash course in how to be a playwright. It was just a wonderful experience, and he and I have gotten to be really good friends through that. But since then, I've written a dozen plays. I would never have written a play. I'm quite sure of it without having had that opportunity. So that was a big, big deal for me. And also having to, or not having to, but having decided to do a piece in that original music and poetry that was both artistic but also historically accurate, to the point that all those places that are in that album, I've been to all those places. I've been to Horsehead Crossing. I've been to Castle Gap. I've been to the Cross Timbers. I've been on the JA. I've been I went over Trinchera Pass. I went down there to the Trinity River in Dallas. I went to New Margaret, where not far from where the Cynthia Ann Parker was recaptured. That kind of stuff really informed not only the work, but also my process. And it also, I don't want to say propelled me, but it marked me as being a bit of a different kind of writer. And someone that was not afraid of the real story, but was willing to use that for the basis for a creative work. And there are just not that many of us out there doing it. It takes a different approach, and it takes a little more rigor, I think. You have to really keep your nose to the grindstone. But if you do, good things happen. Cynthia Ann Parker, that song "White Women's Clothes," and I was lost in that, and happened to. So I did what I always did on these historic things. I went back and did more research. Then I came across an article that had been written, an interview with Cynthia Ann Parker right before she died. And they asked her these questions, and one of the things she answered about what she hated most about being back with, quote, her people, which is what the interviewer had asked her, was she said she hated the white women's clothes. And, and it was like this bolt of lightning or a ray of light came down and went, that's the song, that's the story. That's the whole thing in this one phrase. And, you can't make that stuff up. You can't invent it, but it's out there if you go look for it. And so that has been the thing that I try to keep my antenna out for all the time when I'm working, even if it's not a specific historical project. It's still, even in writing about your friend or writing about something that happened to you in your life, there is some element like that phrase, white women's clothes, that's waiting for you to find it. And if you're willing to dig enough, you're going to come across that. And that's going to really inform your work. And so that's been an enormous blessing to me. It's not like I wasn't doing that beforehand. But boy, that project cemented it, it was kind of like one of those moments of, oh yeah, I understand now what I'm doing. It didn't make it any easier to do, but I at least knew that that's what I was supposed to be doing. So in that way, it's been an incredibly important piece of work. And the only thing that compares to it is later when I wrote the play My Cowboy's Gift, that, for a lot of different reasons, was another step forward in a way of creating things that most recently led me to write that 45-minute poem keynote. That is a direct outgrowth of Cowboy's Gift from 10 or so years before that, in terms of a style of how you can take poetry and song, and it allows you a latitude in delivering an idea that's not necessarily poetic, that you wouldn't have otherwise. And so those things have been really, really important to me.
One of the songs on Andy's Charlie Goodnight album is titled The Last Buffalo Hunt. The first verse says this: "As going on 13 and 19 and 16, a new world replacing the old. Ranges took fences, the plows took the grasses, cow trails were taken by roads. Papa packed the Buick and Mama saw to it we dressed in our best Sunday clothes. Set out at daylight for old Colonel Goodnight's to watch the last hunt for buffalo."
The West is one of those eras that the people who were part of it knew it was a short thing. The trail drive period really is about about a decade. Because when wire went up in the mid-1870s, that pretty much put an end to not only driving cattle through it, but also the need to do it. If the reason you drive cattle was to get them to a railhead. Well, wire didn't show up unless there was a railhead to deliver it. You can't carry much wire very far in a wagon, not very much wire because it's heavy. And you got to have posts and equipment to string it and all that. So that period is over, and that also marked the end of free range. So there was a big change going on, and Native people, after the Red River Wars were done, with Quanah Parker finally going in and the defeat of Custer, but then the defeat of the Sioux afterwards, it was clear to anybody who was alive at that time, red or white, that an era was over with. And Goodnight was certainly the case, and they had also seen the huge herds of buffalo reduced to a handful of animals saved by people like Charlie and Mary Ann Goodnight. So they could see these enormous changes taking place. And Goodnight said, I would like to see a buffalo hunt. And so he had some buffalo. He invited Native American friends of his. None of them were Comanche that came. They were Kiowa, who came out to the Goodnight Ranch, and they had this big hoop-de-doo and invited people. One of the contemporary accounts said it took a half day to park the cars. That's 1916 was when this happened. So cars were a pretty new thing, but it still took a half day to park them. At least 2 people flew in on an airplane. There were lots of people that came by buckboard and wagon and horseback along with the cars. And the Kiowa, one of them was Harvard educated. He was an agent for the reservation. They all showed up at the event wearing suits and ties, because that's the way they were dressed on the reservation now. And, of course, they rode saddles, which a lot of people think about Native people riding bareback all the time or on a blanket, but Native people, at least in the plains, the horse came from the Spanish. The Spanish never rode bareback. They rode with saddles. And so did Native people. In fact, Comanche, for the longest time, mounted from the right side of the horse because that's the way the Spanish mounted. So it wasn't unusual to have saddles, but already the nostalgia, the misguided view of history, was creeping into it. So they asked, because they filmed this last buffalo hunt, they asked them to put an Indian blanket over the saddle so it would look like they were bareback. And they took their coats and ties off, but they were still wearing white shirts and regular trousers. So they turn out a buffalo, they shoot it, and it's filmed, and then they have a big barbecue. And my grandmother was there, and then not too long after that, they were living in Texoma. They walked across the Oklahoma side of the line to the movie theater, and a clip from that film was part of the news trailer for the thing, and it showed. And my grandmother reported being so surprised to see herself in this Buick car that they were in go by the camera, while they're setting up the thing. So it was quite an event, well documented, in terms of what went on and how many people there were and so on. So but it's interesting that by 1916, the nostalgic view of history had already triumphed. It was not 30 years old at the time, and already we were recasting the story in a way that made sense to how we wanted things to be. This is a song that I wrote about what I thought was a particularly poignant moment in Goodnight's life. He was just in his 50s, and he sold out his half of the JA to the Adair family. He wound up living to be 93, so he was just a little over halfway through his life. But it was like, in some ways, it was the most important thing he ever did, the JA Ranch. Yeah, I mean, he did lots of other things. He had a very active life. But, when I wrote all this, it was I was not quite that old, but close to it. And so it's as you get older, it's a thing that you deal with. Guy Clark in his song Desperado's Waiting on a Train, about the old man who had run his fingers through 70 years of living and wonder if ever well he drilled gone dry. That whole notion about have you done your stuff? Is there more to do? How does that fit into your life? And so that was really an interesting thing to me and personal to me at the time. And I wrote this, and I recorded it, and it was only after the album had been cut that I found out that Buck really had wanted to sing this song. And I'd give anything to have known that, because I'd had him sing it, But I didn't, and he didn't, and so... Sold out, and it's time for leaving. I cleaned out my desk, and it's all packed away. No man is ever too old to start over, but I feel like an old man today. I've said goodbye to my partner, goodbye to the cowhands who work the J.A. Molly, you're ready, but give me a moment. I've just one goodbye left to say. Goodbye to my Palo Duro. Goodbye to your ranges that I love so true. Goodbye to your river, your bright painted canyon. I'll never do better than you. I'll never do better than you. Like the buffalo and the Comanche, my farewell is neither fair nor complete. When leaving is dying, the nature of parting's a damn sight more sorrow than sweet. In the labor and the love of a lifetime, what's right and what's wrong, they're confusing to me. If I take the credit for the things that she is, I'll take blame for the things she could be. Goodbye to my Palo Duro. Goodbye to your ranges that I love so true. Goodbye to your river, your bright painted canyon. I'll never do better than you. I'll never do better than you. I'll never do better than you.
Thanks for taking the time to do an interview.
Well, it's been fun.
right, folks, that's it for today's show. I'd like to thank Andy Wilkinson for taking the time to visit with me. You can find out more about Andy at andywilkinson.org. You can find out more about me and this show at andyhedges.com. And if you'd like to support the show, you can make a donation there at the website. If you'd like to contact me with a question or a comment or a story, I'd love to hear from you. Send an email to andy@andyhedges.com. Thank you for listening to Cowboy Crossroads.